The book really is an amalgam of looking at the Civil War through serious literature and historical memory, and then myth and tragedy in American history, and the Civil War's place in American history. All of these are going to be interesting to us here in the sesquicentennial, and why I believe everyone needs to read this book right now while we're entering the sesqui.
Before the end of the weekend.
Exactly is fine with us. And you won't put it down. I know I didn't. Very briefly, why do you think there's so much value in understanding the Civil War through literature? And you think all of these men have literary bents?
Well, literature contributes mightily, whether it's great fiction or whether it's in nonfiction essay form. It contributes mightily to the stories that we believe we're living, to the narratives we believe we're living in. Historical memory is, in essence, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we come to believe, pass on, reinforce, rehearse for the next generation. Each of these particular writers, from very different backgrounds and in very different methods and modes, and that's why I chose them. Warren, the Southern poet, novelist, essayist who comes north and spends the last 40 years of his life, most of it at Yale University, and his papers are also at Yale, which helped. Wilson, who's New Jersey-born, upper crust, father, a stalwart Republican, goes to Princeton, becomes a literary critic, but also had lots of family in Virginia. Catton, who's a thoroughgoing Michigan Yankee who devoted his historian's life after he turned 50 to trying to write the history of the Union soldier. And then Baldwin. Baldwin was always referred to as a Northern Negro, and that is what he was. He never went south till he was 34 years old. Each of them was trying to get at, for their readers, the depth of the myths by which Americans live, the stories we tell ourselves, our deep kind of anthropological myths. Wilson was out to try to tear those myths up, thank you very much, he probably would say, and dispense with them. He thought that the mythologies in the minds of people led them to become imperialist. It led to national self-righteousness. It led to triumphalism. It led to cant and piety, and Wilson hated that. Robert Penn Warren hated those things too, by and large. He just did it often more artfully. But all of them, again, whether writing fiction or nonfiction, had huge audiences. We're not talking about obscure, corner of the bookstore writers here. Robert Penn Warren's the only American writer ever to win the Pulitzer in both poetry and fiction. His book, All the King's Men, is a masterpiece. It's often called the great American novel about politics, but it's really a great Civil War novel. You got to get to about page 250 to understand that. The rest of it becomes clear. They're all giving us the stories, or they are criticizing the stories by which we live, in effect, by looking back in particular toward the Civil War era. That's why literature matters. Literature matters because it's art that puts stories in our head that gives us identities and tells us who we are.
David, I know William Faulkner probably died about this time, and he's not writing
and he could be in this book.
But yeah, because he had quite an impact.
Oh, he had a huge impact.
On the war, on what we believe about the war.
Right, Well, and I've been asked by more than, actually I was asked the other day at Yale, they did a panel on my book, and one of my colleagues in the English department said, "Why isn't Faulkner in your book?" And
there are many we can say about that.
I actually have a long.
We have a nice essay.
I have a long footnote where I buried. Actually, it was originally in the introduction, and my editor slashed it out. I have a long footnote.
To it in the intro, and whom else could have been in this?
I piled up a list of about 30 people who could be in this book, and Faulkner died in 1962.
Okay,
and most of his important works are long past. He'd gone to Hollywood by then, and I really wanted. I'm not copping out. I mean, taking on Faulkner would have been.
No, I'm not suggesting.
No,
that
it takes courage, probably more than I have,
to
to write seriously about Faulkner, but I wanted people who were at the top of their art. in the
that time,
50s and
right.
60s,
Yeah.
because they were then, not that Faulkner didn't react to the civil rights movement, he famously,
Yeah.
infamously reacted to
Right.
the civil rights movement. In fact, one of James Baldwin's best essays is his attack on William Faulkner in 1956 for Faulkner's kind of nice way of saying segregation is all right,
Yeah.
or that the country's not ready. And Baldwin took that word "ready" and worked on it. But yeah, Faulkner could be here. So can Margaret Walker, by the way.
Well,
Yeah.
there's a footnote to
Right.
that, and everyone
Yeah.
should read that footnote as to who else could have been in here.
Yeah, well, that's where I cop out. Yeah.
Bill, I did notice, by the way, as an Illinoisan, that Central Illinois wasn't put in as a border section, border state section, because it certainly was. And there certainly were border state problems earlier in the war in Central Illinois, and even Little Egypt, Southern Illinois. Cairo was further south than Richmond. So that may have been, like Delaware, it could have been a little footnote, maybe. But I do want to ask you this. Lincoln and his political diplomacy, how did he learn this with border states? Did he come in with a preconceived notion, do you believe? Did he move on as the war moved on? And who else in his cabinet was helping him with this?
The second part of the question is Montgomery Blair and also Edward Bates were border state men, and they were pretty conservative too, particularly on emancipation, on slavery and colonization. Bates was not so much in favor of colonization, although he supported it. But Montgomery Blair was, the whole Blair family from Maryland were. But you mentioned that from Central Illinois. Well, that was Abraham Lincoln's where he lived before he went to the White House, and he knew the people there. They were from Kentucky, from the border states, and he was. His wife was, and her family were there in Springfield, some of them. And so he had those connections, and he was a Whig.
And you criticize him for some of his verbiage after the November election of '60.
Yes, right, for his failure to make a statement, a public statement to reassure at least the border states. He wasn't going to reassure
So
the
how
Deep
did
South.
he come to them as he approached his inauguration and afterward as president itself? What were his initial steps with the border states?
Well, he met with many of the representatives and senators when he came to Washington in late February, just a couple of weeks before his inauguration, and they were all telling him, "Look, don't coerce the Lower South, or else we've got a problem in our state. We could leave the Union." And also the issue of slavery too. He knew about these things. But, of course, he had an oath, as he said, to preserve the Union and the laws, the federal laws that related to that. And that was the basis for his action here against the South.
Now, the border states, as you mentioned, were in flux during much of the war.
Yeah.
My father, a psychoanalyst, would have said that we were fluxed again. So how were we fluxed in the border states during the war?
Oh, that's I just threw that word in, I suppose, to mean that it was, a lot of things were up in the air with the government, with the commandos, military commandos who were there, and these were Union commandos, but they had the task of suppressing the secessionists and the rebels. And they went a little too far on some occasions, and of course Lincoln himself did, probably in Maryland, when he issued the writ of habeas corpus, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and started rounding up, or permitted the military to round up some of the legislators.
Well, you say that Lincoln was crucial in winning the battle for the border states. How was he crucial? In what respect?
Well, he had to. He couldn't go too far, for one thing. He could not overreach here. He had to be patient with them and pretty much go along with Kentucky's neutrality, for example, until they came to their senses, or at least until, in this case, the Confederates invaded Kentucky to protect one of their posts there. So that was important, that he understood that he could not act in a radical way to preserve the Union in those states, and he must work through the Union governments there. He couldn't just, he just simply couldn't suppress it.
Kentucky was a brutally divided state too, no? I mean, some counties,
That's true.
One section pro-Confederate,
Yeah.
ones, and towns, families. I mean,
Yeah.
even the statistics of how many fought on both sides. I mean, I don't remember them,
Yeah,
but
right.
But I mean, and it must have been, in that sense, utterly unpredictable. I mean, when you're looking at a place where possibly 40% of the population is fighting against the Union.
But if you got the state government on your side,
Well, true.
and Lincoln, used his political skill to do that over time, and so many of the pro-Confederates went south. You see, to like General Buckner and Breckinridge.
Breckinridge, yeah.
Breckinridge is a classic example, of course. The former vice president, and now and was a senator when he went south, and candidate for president before.
Well, he had to keep the border state unionists
He had to keep them happy.
in his circle,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
they were on that fence many times, buffeted by compensation for emancipation,
Yeah.
emancipation
Yeah.
itself, using the black in the army, and they were buffeted
Yeah,
around
he wanted to
be
move,
a unionist.
right, he
They
wanted
may
to
have been
move.
secessionists,
Right.
anti-secession, but they also were not ready for slavery to be just evicted.
Right, and Lincoln understood that, and he had to move carefully, and that was the plan of compensated emancipation, to get the border states to go along with this, and they refused to do so.
A man who, I'm doing an appraisal, strangely enough, of a letter right now of Lincoln to General Schenck in May of '63. And he's writing about Governor Francis Thomas, who had been governor of Maryland back in the 40s.
Yeah.
And he says he's an able and very true man. I do not know that he agrees with me in everything. This is Lincoln. Perhaps he does not about Thomas, but he has given me evidence of sincere friendship and, as I think, of patriotism. Now, here is a man, Thomas, who was certainly back and forth on this, and he wasn't very happy with blacks in the army, but he was also a unionist, so he was one of those that was
Neither
in this
was,
problem.
right, Thomas was in Congress at this time, I
Yeah.
believe, but neither was the governor of Maryland, Bradford.
Maryland, I'm sorry.
He came along, but after the Emancipation Proclamation, it began to sink into some of these unionists that, look, it's a war measure, and we should accept it as such. Now, there were radical unionists in the states who said it was a good thing to get rid of slavery, pure and simple. But the conservatives, I refer to them as conservative unionists, and they were at that time referred to as conservatives. They saw that Lincoln has said that it will help us win this war, and it's coming apart anyway. So we should get money for it. But in the end, they did not. Congress approved in principle the idea of compensation after Lincoln did some lobbying and all in '62, and after the District of Columbia bill passed, in which the slaveholders there were
Did
compensated.
the congressmen from the border states fight that?
Yes, they did. They certainly did. There was only one, I think, who supported the district bill.